Hello, St. Peter's. Welcome back to our chapter book series. We're in week 15, and we are going to finish our book today, The World According to Humphrey. It's been a fun ride with our class pet hamster, Humphrey. So I hope you're ready for the exciting conclusion. We're going to find out a couple of things about Mrs. Brisbane, the teacher, and maybe why she's not so crazy about Humphrey. We'll see if they can become friends in the end. So let's remember and think back to the last two chapters. Remember, AJ took Humphrey home, and what was different about AJ's house? It was loud, loud, loud. They always had the TV going. People were always yelling. The mom had the radio on in the kitchen. He thought it was too loud, so he unplugged the TV, and they had to learn how to do things without TV for a while. They played games, right? They played cards together. The kids even were having so much fun, it was past their bedtime. They didn't even realize it. So they found out that maybe having the TV on all the time was a little too much. And then we also got to meet Aldo's girlfriend, Maria. It was quite a fun adventure last time. So this week we left off with Humphrey not having anywhere to go over Thanksgiving. So he was either going to have to stay home alone or in the classroom alone or go home with Mrs. Brisbane, which he wasn't very keen on doing. So I'm excited to find out what happens. Are you ready to find out what happens? Good. I'm sure you've gotten all of your schoolwork done. We're getting ready. We're on Christmas break. We can just sit back, relax, and listen to the end of the story. If you haven't heard the rest of the chapters, go back and catch up. You could do a binge watch of The World According to Humphrey. You can always take an AR quiz at the end. If you do, it's worth 4 points and part of our Christmas break reading challenge. You could earn your way to a prize. All right, let's see. My friends are here. I've got Ralph, Daisy, Magic Monkey, and our Pig of Joy is there with, of course, our jar of joy, because we are still spreading joy throughout the land. Don't you love spreading joy at Christmas time? I think it just feels even more special. We'll get to that later. For right now, let's finish The World According to Humphrey by Betty G. Birney. We are on chapter 13. Thanks, but no thanks.
Since Mrs. Brisbane didn't say a word to me on the drive home, I had time to reflect on the last few months. I had not had a bad experience with any of the families I had visited. In fact, they had all been gracious and welcoming, except Miranda's dog, Clem. But I know how to handle him. In return, I'd lent them a helping paw here and there. After all, you can learn a lot about yourself by getting to know another species. I was overdue for trouble, and I was likely to get it at Brisbane's House of Horrors. That's how I pictured her home, decorated with skeletons and bats and eerie jack-o'-lanterns all year long. I was shivering at the picture I had in mind when Mrs. Brisbane actually spoke. "Humphrey, I need you like I need a hole in the head," she complained. "The same to you," I squeaked back rudely, knowing she wouldn't understand. "I don't know what Bert's going to say about you, but whatever it is, it won't be pleasant. Nothing he says is lately," she continued. Bert? Who's Bert? Then I realized it must be her husband, the one who's sick. Well, I was certainly not looking forward to meeting him based on what I'd just heard. "It won't be much of a Thanksgiving," she said. "We don't have much to be thankful for this year, but I'll try." "Good for you," I squeaked. She almost smiled. "Thanks for the support." The Brisbane house was yellow with white shutters and lots of big trees. Colored leaves covered the yard. "On top of everything else, I have to rake," Mrs. Brisbane said through gritted teeth. Inside, the house was surprisingly cozy. Not a skeleton or bat in sight. Lots of pretty pictures on the walls and some big yellow flowers in a vase on the table. "Bert, I'm home," Mrs. Brisbane called out. A few seconds later, an old man rolled into the room in a wheelchair. His gray hair was uncombed and stuck out in places it shouldn't. His chin was covered with gray stubble, and he wore very wrinkled tan pajamas. His expression was so sour, he looked as if he just drank a glass of vinegar. Mrs. Brisbane set my cage on the low coffee table. "We have a guest for the weekend." I could tell she was trying hard to sound cheery. "His name is Humphrey." Mr. Brisbane sneered. "This is unacceptable. For the little pay you get, that school can't force you to spend your weekend babysitting a rat." I bit my tongue to keep from saying something unsqueakably bad. "They're not forcing me," argued Mrs. Brisbane. "It's just that no one else could do it. Let's not make a mountain out of a molehill." Pardon me, but I resented being called a molehill almost as much as I resented being called a rat. Mrs. Brisbane quickly changed the subject. "I thought you were going to get dressed today." "Why should I? I'm not going to see anybody," Bert Brisbane growled, "except you and the rat." Mrs. Brisbane got up and walked out of the room without saying another word. Boy, nobody in room 26 could get away with talking to Mrs. Brisbane like that. I wished I could send her husband to Principal Morales' office right now. Everything was real quiet around the house for a while. Mrs. Brisbane changed her clothes to jeans and moved my cage onto a card table in the corner of the living room. Then she sat down and read the Guide to the Care and Feeding of Hamsters and the chart my classmates kept on me. "Looks like your friends have been taking good care of you," she said. "Very, very, very good," I squeaked. "She fed me and gave me clean water, and then she and Mr. Brisbane ate dinner in some other room while they watched TV. They went to bed early. I'll bet they didn't say 2 words to each other. Even Ms. Mac talked more at home than they did, and she lived alone." The next morning, Mrs. Brisbane was up very early, and soon the house smelled yummy. I thought maybe I would like this Thanksgiving thing after all, at least the good smelling and eating part. What I didn't like about Thanksgiving was Mr. Brisbane. While Mrs. Brisbane was clattering pots and clinking pans and making things smell good, he sat in his wheelchair in the living room and frowned. No, I know a better vocabulary word. Scowled. Like that. After a while, he called into the kitchen. "Sue, why don't you stop all the cooking and just sit down for a minute?" Mrs. Brisbane popped her head out the door and said it wouldn't be Thanksgiving without turkey and all the trimmings. And then Mr. Brisbane said he didn't have anything to be thankful for. Mrs. Brisbane went back in the kitchen and banged around some pots and pans again. That sour expression on the old man's face was starting to get to me. So I decided to take a little spin on my wheel. I really got that thing going at high speed. I was going so fast I couldn't even see whether Mr. Brisbane was smiling or frowning. Finally, Mrs. Brisbane came into the room to sit down. "Would you look at that, Sue?" her husband asked. "Oh, he does that all the time," she said. "Just spinning his wheels like me. Stuck in a cage and going nowhere." Mr. Brisbane's voice was so grim, I stopped spinning. Phew, I was a little dizzy. "You're wrong, Bert," said Mrs. Brisbane. "Humphrey's not stuck. He goes everywhere. Every weekend he goes to another house. He eats different foods. He gets out of the cage and runs through mazes. He runs and jumps and climbs. You're the one spinning your wheels and going nowhere. You're stuck in a cage, but it's a cage you made." Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I heard Mrs. Brisbane talk that way. Mr. Brisbane was surprised, too. Do you think I wanted that car to hit me? Do you think that was my choice? He asked. Of course not, Bert. I'm so grateful you lived through it. That's the point. You're alive, but you sure don't act like it. With that, Mrs. Brisbane got up and went back into the kitchen. Meanwhile, Mr. Brisbane scowled and frowned and glared at me. Finally, Mrs. Brisbane put the food on the dining room table. I watched them eating their dinner from my vantage point on the table in the living room. They ate, but they didn't say much. The food is delicious, Mr. Brisbane finally said. That's the nicest thing I'd heard him say so far. Thank you, Mrs. Brisbane replied. There was silence for a while, and then Mr. Brisbane said, Just think, last year after Thanksgiving dinner, Jason and I threw the football around the backyard. Now I'm stuck here and Jason is in Tokyo. Let's call him Bert, his wife suggested. It's too early there, he said. We'll have to call later. Football, Jason, Tokyo. You can learn a lot if you stop spinning and start listening. I listened late that night when they called Jason, who turned out to be their grown-up son who was working in Tokyo, which is far, far, far away, even farther than Brazil, according to the maps in room 26. Tokyo is in Japan. Boy, there were more Mrs. Brisbanes than I'd ever dreamed. One was mean to me. One was nice to students. One was a wife. Another one was a mother. One was a cook. One wore dark pantsuits and the other wore jeans. But which one was the real Mrs. Brisbane? That night, as they headed out of the living room and toward the bedroom, I heard Mrs. Brisbane, the wife, say, I know you think I was being hard on you, Bert, but it really is time for you to think about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Mr. Brisbane didn't answer. Tip 13. Remember, hamsters are very, very curious. From the Guide to Care and Feeding of Hamsters by Dr. Harvey H. Hammer. So we just found out that Mr. Brisbane is in a wheelchair because he was in a car accident. He got hit by a car. So even though he's alive, he's feeling kind of sorry for himself. That makes him grouchy. And Mrs. Brisbane has to hear it every day. So it's kind of hard, which is probably why she didn't want to bring Humphrey home, because she thought it was just one more thing she'd have to take care of. Let's see how they figure this out. Chapter 14, Hide and Go Squeak. Apparently, the day after Thanksgiving, humans do two things. Eat leftovers from the day before and go shopping. Mr. Brisbane didn't go shopping, of course, but Mrs. Brisbane left early in the morning after telling Mr. Brisbane that there were plenty of leftovers for him in the refrigerator. So there I was, stuck with old sourpuss. And all he did was sit in his wheelchair, looking unhappy. I'd much rather have been hanging out with Principal Morales or chatting with Saya's family. I could have been tricking Miranda's dog, playing cards with AJ's family, and watching Aldo balance a broom on his finger. But no, I was watching a sad and grouchy old man act sad and grouchy. I could have just settled in for my nap, but I remembered what Mrs. Brisbane had said. This man had to get out of his cage. Out of your cage, I squeaked out loud without realizing it. Quiet, you little rat, Mr. Brisbane growled at me. Then he wheeled over to the front window and stared out. Okay, if he wasn't going to get out of his cage, then I'd get out of mine, because I had a new plan. Mr. Brisbane didn't notice me open the lock that doesn't lock. He didn't see me scamper out of the cage, across the table, and onto the couch. He wasn't aware that I leaped down to the floor. He didn't even think about me until I stood in the middle of the living room and said, "Catch me if you can." I know he only heard me squeaking, but I'm sure he got his attention. He was as surprised as I could be to see me there.
How did you get out? And how am I ever going to get you back in?
He rolled toward me.
Come on, whatever your name is, let's get back in the cage.
I let him get just close enough to reach me. He bent forward, cupping his hands, but just as he reached out to grab me, I dashed over to the opposite side of the room.
You little rat, he said. You can't outsmart me.
He rolled over to the closet and took out a baseball cap off a hook. Then he approached and I let him get almost within arm's reach. This time he raised the baseball cap up and said, "Okay, fella, let's play ball." "We'll see about that," I squeaked as I hustled off to the living room. We quickly established the rules of the contest. 1, I would stay out in the open, in places he could reach in his wheelchair. 2, he would use his cap to capture me, if he could. Once he reached the dining room, I rushed into the den.
"Oh, think you're clever? Well, we'll see who's clever," he challenged.
From the den, I scuttled over to the hallway. By now, Mr. Brisbane's cheeks were pink and he was almost smiling.
"You're smart, but you won't win this one."
This time, I let him get that cap within a whisker of capturing me, just to keep the game interesting. Then I scurried back to the living room. But before he followed me, Mr. Brisbane slammed the bathroom, bedroom, and guest room doors. Aha! He was limiting my range of possibilities. Pretty cunning. In the living room, I decided to make a bold move. I hid under the couch. Then I let Mr. Brisbane stew for 5 minutes.
"Come here, Humphrey. You'll have to come out sooner or later," he called.
And I thought he didn't know my name. He shook the curtains and pushed the chairs to see if he could rouse me. Too bad he didn't think of using sunflower seeds like Mr. Morales did. Yum! Too bad. I finally got kind of bored. So I made a dash for the dining room. Mr. Brisbane followed, and this time I let him scoop me up in the cap. "I win!" he shouted triumphantly. He was beaming with pride as he stared down at me. "But you were a worthy opponent." He put me back in my cage and I scrambled into my sleeping house. I have to admit the game had made me a little drowsy. I don't think it was very long before Mrs. Brisbane returned, carrying several shopping bags full of packages. "What happened, Bert?" she asked when she saw her husband. "Nothing," he said. "But your face is all rosy. You look different, and you're wearing a baseball cap," she said. "Sit down, Sue," he answered. "I'll tell you all about it." He told her every detail of our match, chuckling and swinging his cap back and forth. "I guess there are some things I can still do," he said. "Now, how about a game of gin rummy?" Mrs. Brisbane was almost speechless. "Okay," she said, starting to get up. Mr. Brisbane waved her away with his cap. "I'll get the cards. You just sit." As he wheeled into the den, Mrs. Brisbane turned to me and quietly said, "Thank you, Humphrey. Thank you." Mr. Brisbane didn't frown the rest of the day and evening, except when Mrs. Brisbane beat him at cards. The next morning, which was Saturday, she couldn't even find her husband. "Where could he be?" she asked. She asked me. "He hasn't left the house in months." A minute later, he came into the house from the garage, his lap full of boards and bricks and things. "I've got an idea for our friend Humphrey," he said. Mr. and Mrs. Brisbane spent most of the rest of the day building an obstacle course on the coffee table in the den. They lined up boards along the side so I couldn't stray too far. And then they set up things for me to climb over and climb under, like bricks with holes in the side and big cardboard tubes. And Mr. Brisbane constructed a series of ramps for me to climb. Oh, we had a wonderful day. Mr. Brisbane got out a stopwatch to time me on my runs, and they made bets on how long it would take me to get from start to finish. Mrs. Brisbane even added a few treats to the maze. Bits of apple and a biscuit. I had fun, fun, fun. The Brisbanes did too, I could tell. On Sunday afternoon, the Brisbanes invited their neighbors over to watch me run my maze. Mr. and Mrs. Robinson brought their 5-year-old twins along. "Oh, glad to see you looking so chipper," Mr. Robinson told Mr. Brisbane. "I think he's finally feeling better," Mrs. Brisbane whispered to Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Brisbane looked a little vinegary again on Monday morning, though. "Why can't we keep him here, Sue?" he asked. "Oh, the children would never forgive me," she told him. "He's really their hamster, but," she grinned, "there's a 2-week Christmas vacation coming up soon. I think Humphrey better spend it here." Could I believe my cute furry ears? She liked me so much, she actually wanted me to come back. Oh, this was a whole new Mrs. Brisbane, one who liked me. By the time Mrs. Brisbane and I returned to room 26, I was pretty tired. But it was a good tired, and I knew I could rest up for my weekend during recess. Tip 14. Hamsters should be let out of their cages to run in a closed environment for an hour or 2 at a time. From the Guide to Care and Feeding of Hamsters by Dr. Harvey H. Hammer. That's what they did for him. Wow, he ended up having a good time. All right, now for the conclusion. Chapter 15, Happy Hamster Day. In December, things in room 26 really began to change. For one thing, it got cold outside and a little chilly by my window. In the early morning, frost pictures would appear on the glass. One picture looked like a big snowflake. Another looked like a lion. Scary. Still, it was nice and cozy in my sleeping house. More snowflakes appeared. Not real ones, but cut-out paper snowflakes, bordering all the chalkboards. And there were snowmen made of fluffy cotton and pictures of candles and packages and sleighs. Oh, the holidays were almost here. Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. There were songs to be sung and presents to be wrapped and a big 2-week vacation to come. The weekend after Thanksgiving break, I went home with Pay Attention Art. He paid a lot of attention to me. But sometimes, not every night during the week, Mrs. Brisbane would take me home to see Mr. Brisbane, and he'd put up his obstacle course, and we'd laugh and squeak and have a wonderful time. The next weekend, I stayed at Gail Morgenstern's house. Friday night was really nice because she convinced her mom to let me watch while she lit the menorah for the family. And the food was yummy. I was glad that Mrs. Brisbane didn't take me home every night. For one thing, if I ran the obstacle course every night, I'd probably waste away to nothing. For another thing, I wouldn't have been able to see Aldo. Aldo could now balance the broom on his head. Yup, he put the tip of the broomstick on top of his head, and he could keep it up there a while. He'd have to bob and weave to keep it balanced, and he made funny faces too. But one night during the week, Aldo pulled his chair up close to my cage and he said, "Humphrey, old pal, I've got something to discuss." This sounded serious, so I put on my most serious and problem-solving face. "I'm thinking of getting Maria a ring for Christmas. You know, like an engagement ring with something shiny in it. Oh, I know we haven't known each other very long, and we wouldn't have to get married right away. On the other hand, I'm no spring chicken, and I'd like to settle down and raise a couple of kids and maybe a couple of hamsters too, you know." "I understand," I squeaked softly. "So what do you think?" Aldo fixed his big brown eyes on me. "Should I ask her to marry me?" I stood up on my hind legs and screeched, "Do it, do it, do it!"
Then he stood up and shouted, "You're right, I will. I'd be crazy not to." He raced out of the room so fast he forgot his cleaning cart. But when he returned for it, he yelled, "Thanks!" Oh, sometimes, most times, it pays to squeak up. The third weekend after Thanksgiving, I spent at Heidi Hopper's house and watched her family put up their Christmas tree. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, second only to the little tree Heidi put in my cage. It was made of my favorite treat, broccoli. And then it was almost holiday vacation. Suddenly it seemed as if we didn't have quite as much work to do in class. Everybody was planning the holiday party for the last day of school. One day, Garth, who never used to wait for the bell, stayed after school to ask Mrs. Brisbane a question. "May I please bring Humphrey home with me over the holidays?" he asked. Mrs. Brisbane looked as surprised as I was. "Well, Garth, I thought that was a problem." Garth smiled broadly. "My mom is much better now. And Dad says it's okay to bring Humphrey home." Mrs. Brisbane smiled back. "Oh, that is wonderful news. But I think 2 weeks might be a little much. How about the first weekend in January?" Garth nodded, but he looked disappointed. "Tell you what, why don't you have your parents bring you by our house to see Humphrey over the holidays? You can watch him run his obstacle course." Garth didn't look disappointed anymore. On the last day of school, everybody was very dressed up. I had on my fur coat, as usual. Mrs. Brisbane wore a red and green striped sweater and a green skirt. She also wore a Santa Claus hat. This was an entirely new Mrs. Brisbane, the dressing up Mrs. Brisbane. "Class, I have an important announcement. We're having a surprise visitor this morning before our party, so there'll be no vocabulary test today." After the cheers died down, Mrs. Brisbane went out in the hall and waved. A minute later, you'll never guess who entered the classroom. Mr. Bert Brisbane. He was wearing a Santa Claus hat, too. He looked a lot better now. No gray stubble or wrinkled pajamas. On his lap, he had a large box. Mrs. Brisbane introduced him to the class, and they all applauded. Then he told them that his surprise was actually for me. First, he pulled out something like my cage, only bigger. "This is my gift to Humphrey. This extension attaches to his cage and makes it bigger. Now, you're all going to help me build Humphrey his holiday present, his very own playground." Oh, the kids squealed and giggled and clapped, and I couldn't hold back a big squeal of my own. I could keep my homey cage with its lock that doesn't lock, but now I also have my own park to play in. Oh, Mr. Brisbane gathered my classmates around the big table and explained his plans. Mrs. Brisbane unloaded the pieces. First, there was a seesaw, then a tree branch to swing from, a big jungle gym, and 2 ladders, one to climb and one to walk across like a bridge. Oh, my! Saya held me while the other kids worked on my cage. She patted me gently and murmured comforting words. Meanwhile, Mr. Brisbane patiently instructed the children as they arranged the pieces. He even made sure everybody got a turn. Then Mr. Morales dropped by to see how things were going. He was wearing a tie that had little Christmas lights that really lit up. He and Mr. Brisbane stood by the children, watching as my playground took shape. "Oh, looks like Bert should be a teacher too," the principal told Mrs. Brisbane. "Oh, he already is," I heard Mrs. Brisbane respond. "He just started teaching arts and crafts to seniors and kids at the community center." "Oh, so he's made a new start," said the principal. "Thanks to Humphrey." I believe those words were the best present I could ever have. "Guess what I got my kids for Christmas?" the principal asked. "A hamster. Maybe it's a present for me as well. I think my papa will enjoy it too."
When Saya put me back in my cage, everyone watched as I raced to my new playground, climbed the jungle gym, made a leap to the tree branch, and jumped over to the seesaw. Now I could have recess any time I wanted. Whoopee! Just then the room mothers arrived with cupcakes and juice. While they passed the food out, Saya and Miranda slipped quietly out of the room. A little while later, Mrs. Brisbane announced that she had another surprise. Gifts for the class. The door opened and in came Miranda and Saya wearing red dresses trimmed in white fur, not real fur like me, and white fur hats. They each had a basket filled with small presents, and they danced around the room singing a song about the wonders of winter while they passed the gifts out. When the kids opened their packages, they each found a keychain with a small, furry toy hamster attached. The hamsters came in all colors: red, green, purple, gold, silver. Nice. The room mothers presented Mrs. Brisbane with a gift, a pair of red earrings, which she put on right away. I already thought it was a perfect day, but it wasn't really quite perfect until Mr. Morales peeked out into the hall and announced that he had a big surprise. Oh my goodness, I wasn't sure we could stand many more surprises. And then she walked in, the biggest surprise I could imagine. Ms. Mack was back. She was wearing a long flowered skirt and a bright red blouse, and she had a butterfly in her hair. Oh, not a real one, of course. She also had a huge canvas bag with her. Remember me? She asked with a huge smile. My classmates were thrilled, and they all rushed to her side. Oh, I was so surprised, I was positively squeakless. Mrs. Brisbane made everyone sit down again and asked Ms. Mack. Of course, she insisted on calling her Ms. McNamara about her travels. Ms. Mack told us about the rainforest and teaching in a school in Brazil. Then she opened her big bag and took out a stack of holiday cards. Her Brazilian students had made a card for each child in room 26. While my classmates were sharing their cards with one another, Ms. Mack came over to see me at last. Well, I can see by your cage that you've done very well for yourself, she said with a smile. And here I thought you'd be pining away for me. I have, I squeaked. She reached into her big bag. And I have a present for you, but don't tell anybody. She pulled out a brand new tiny notebook with blank pages, lots of them, and a new tiny pencil with a very sharp point. I thought you might need this. Then she tucked it behind my mirror. Ms. Mack stared at me a little longer and then softly said, I've seen a lot of creatures in a lot of places in the last few months, but you're still the handsomest and smartest of all. Yes, yes, yes. And don't worry, I'll be back to see you again. She was still the same wonderful Ms. Mack. I'd follow her to the ends of the earth, I thought, or at least to Brazil. But then it hit me. As much as I love her and she loves me, Ms. Mack doesn't need me. Not as much as the Brisbanes and my classmates and their families do. Maybe that's what Ms. Mack was thinking when she left me in room 26. This is where I belong. All too soon the bell rang. School was over for the day. School was over for the rest of the year. My head was reeling from all the surprises and excitement as we headed out to the car. In the parking lot, Aldo raced over to greet us and wish us happy holidays. He had come to pick Richie up. I hope you have a very happy holiday too, Mrs. Brisbane told Aldo. Aldo grinned until his huge mustache shook like Santa's tummy. I'm sure I will. You see, I just got engaged. I'm going to be married. Yahoo! I squeaked with delight. Aldo leaned towards me. Thanks, my little friend. That night at the Brisbane's house, there was one more surprise. The doorbell rang and a very tall and good-looking young man appeared. He was wearing a Santa Claus hat, but he wasn't Santa. He was Jason, the Brisbane son. He'd come all the way from Tokyo to surprise his parents. They were so happy to see him, they both cried just a little. I almost cried too. Soon the house was filled with friends and neighbors, and Mrs. Brisbane played piano while everyone sang carols and drank hot cider. I nibbled on raw apples and squeaked along. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I thought about all I'd done in the months since I had left Pet-O-Rama. I didn't know anything about the world then, but I've sure learned a lot. I can read and write, and I know all the state capitals. Just ask me one. I learned you should never, ever turn your back on a dog, and that it's a good idea to turn off the TV once in a while. I found out kids have problems, and so do teachers and principals. Sometimes all people need is a little encouragement. Most of all, I learned that one small hamster really can make a big difference. I decided to write down some of the things I've learned from my adventures, but there was just one more line left in my first notebook. So I thought, and then I scribbled down exactly what I was feeling deep in my hamster heart. Joy, joy, joy to the whole wide world, and that includes you. Signed, Humphrey. The end. Can you believe Humphrey ended with joy, joy, joy to the world? That's exactly what we're trying to spread, our joy to the world. Wow, what do you think about that? What a great way to end the story. He realized he's right where he belongs, right? Even though he misses Ms. Mack, someone he loves very dearly. He realized how much he could help those children and teachers and principals in his school and in room 26. What a good helper he is. I really love that story, and I loved how we ended on Christmas just like we are. They're going home to spend Christmas break. We're going home to spend Christmas break with our families and loved ones. That's what I wish for you, a very happy, joy, joy, joyful Christmas. How would you like to spread some joy? Come on, Joy, we have one last thing to do. Spread some joy before we go on out and have a vacation. Let's see what we're going to do today. Oh, perfect for this whole holiday season. Share your smile. Share your smile. It's free. It makes people feel good. And when you smile, someone will smile back at you. That is a wonderful way to spread joy. I'm so glad that's what we picked today. How about you, Joy? Well, boys and girls, that is the final chapters of Humphrey, but also that's it for the year for 2020. We will begin our next chapter book January 8th or so, the first week of January, that Friday when we come back to school. We will start a new book and have new exciting adventures. So until then, I wish you the happiest of holidays, a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. Throw confetti in the air so we'll be ready for 2021. We'll hopefully all come back, get to be in school together once again. So I wish you and your families that very Merry Christmas. Have fun, play outside, do puzzles when you have to be inside, games, spend time with the people you love the most. That's what I'll be doing as well. All right, boys and girls, until then, don't forget, keep spreading your joy.